Hey everyone, welcome to MicroTeach number 6. This week we're going over module number 60 in your textbook, which is going to be on psychological disorders and defining psychopathology. And this week I wanted to kind of set it up a little bit differently. I don't just want to sit here and kind of spur off definitions to you or explain concepts, because I feel like the information in this section is fairly straightforward, and the table in 60.1 is really great at laying out the major disorders and their symptoms and examples. So if you really wanted to get into any of the breakdown of the disorders, that's a great tool to use. It's taken directly from the DSM. So I feel like you can just go look at that, and I don't need to be telling you guys that. So instead I want to kind of talk more about what your book starts with, which is normality, and defining what normal is. Because there are many ways to do this, and it's easy to look at something and say that's abnormal, or look at a person and say that behavior is abnormal, but there are a lot of different ways that we define what normal is. Because really mental disorder is a lot more common than you might think. In the media or in society it may be it may be portrayed as something that's very abnormal, something that's very unusual, and in the past maybe people have been ridiculed for this abnormality that they have, but really it's a lot more common, and about 20% of the U.S. population, that is talking about adults, will have a diagnosable disorder in a given year. So that's 20%. That's 1 in 5 people. Looking through the classroom, you can pick that out and see that that's quite a number of people. That makes it not so abnormal as you might think. But first, I want to define a mental disorder before we get into any of that talk. Because it's important to define it as a significant impairment in psychological functioning. And it's important because you may have symptoms for a disorder. You might meet symptoms and criteria for depression, but if you don't have that impairment in functioning, it may not be an actual psychological disorder. This functioning is going to be imperative for affecting your day-to-day life. And that's really the crucial factor, and that's why they talk about the time criteria, is that, have you been having this for 4 to 6 reoccurring weeks and things like that, because if it's something just onset, or if it's not affecting your function in any way, they can't treat it as a mental disorder in the same manner. I also wanted to define psychopathology before we move on, because that's essentially what we're talking about in all of this, and that's going to be, it's the scientific study of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. So the DSM-5 will break down disorders into categories like this, to kind of better relate them to each other, and show the crossing of symptoms. But really, psychopathology is the study of all mental disorder. So getting that out of the way, getting kind of into that normalcy talk I wanted to, first I want to talk about statistical abnormality. So you may have heard of the bell curve before, or the normal curve, and this is really looking at the statistical abnormality in a chart. So if you don't know what it looks like, it's figure 60.1, but otherwise, if I can get this to load, which it won't, that's what it looks like. There we go, it's a bell curve. So essentially most people are clustered in the middle. Not that you need to know this, but it's about 68%, and then you have it kind of tailing off on the ends there. So this is a way of defining what normal is. Statistically, the people in the middle are normal, and the people on the edge are outliers. If you took an intelligence test, most people would be in the normal. You wouldn't have somebody that's scoring extremely low or scoring extremely high in really high numbers. You would be more in the middle. But this is a very basic way of defining what normal is, and really this is good for helping us compare groups and things like that. But to take this as defining somebody's mental dysfunction is just incorrect on its own, because somebody can meet maybe this criteria of abnormal in a statistical manner, but have perfect functioning. They could take a measure for depression and score extremely high on depression, but it's not affecting their day-to-day lives, so they really probably don't have a mental disorder, because that is the definition of a mental disorder. So you do have to be careful in just looking at one way of defining normalcy. Another way to look at it is in a social sense, in nonconformity. So this is looking at public standards and behavior that is abnormal to these standards. You could look at drug abuse of, that's an abnormal behavior, or your book, I think, use the example prostitution. Either of those are abnormal behaviors that society would deem is not normal. But really, you, again, have to be careful just using that alone, because you looking at a behavioral and defining it as abnormal, or society looking at a behavior and defining it as abnormal, still doesn't classify it as a mental disorder, because, Johnny down the road who's super eccentric and weird might seem pretty odd and probably has something wrong with them, but your neighbor next door that seems completely normal could be the one with the mental disorder and crippling depression. And so to just look at somebody's behavior and look at how that kind of ties in and how that relates to society and the norms of society, and not take anything else from that, is really a disservice to the person. Another way you could look at it is in a culture factor, and that kind of is still bouncing off of that social norms kind of thing, but if you can imagine someone coming into a new culture completely, and some of their behaviors they may come in with are completely normal to them, but coming into maybe your world, you may look at them and say, yeah, that's kind of weird that they're doing that, there's definitely something wrong with them, but really it's just a difference in culture. So you have to be careful looking at the surface level, and take more thought into defining someone as abnormal. I'm going to get a little bit back into some sort of structure of the terms, because another way of saying this definition of a mental disorder, this psychological functioning, is to say that psychopathological behavior is maladaptive. I think it's a great definition that your book uses, which is that behavior arises from an underlying psychological or biological dysfunction that makes it more difficult for them to meet the demands of day-to-day life. So, for example, take, gambling. So if you want to go and buy a lottery ticket at the gas station when you stop and get gas, it's really not that big a deal. Even if you want to go to WinStar, it's a short enough drive. You can head up there, no big deal. But when it becomes on a consistent basis to where there's that lack of self-control, that's when it becomes a problem. When you start to lose that control over the actions, over the behavior, it becomes this maladaptive process that's now harming you, and it's going to harm your functioning in general. And this plays too, this leads directly into the law, into that, trying to make a plea of insanity is trying to prove that you're not guilty, not because you have a mental disorder, but because your mental disorder affected you so much that you didn't have any self-control over it, but you didn't, at that time, weren't able to understand your consequences, or weren't able to understand your actions or the behavior as abnormal or wrong. And that's the criteria that's needed to met. A lot of people think that if you're insane and you can prove that you're just crazy, that you get off, you do no jail time, it's free and clear, no big deal. But really, it's a lot more involved, and it's not a defense that's used successfully very often. And even if it is, it's not necessarily the outcome that you might think. Because if you're proven to be not guilty by reason of insanity, you are then treated for your mental disorder. You're not, just simply let go. You're not guilty. You're treated not guilty, but because of your insanity. So we need to treat this insanity in order to make sure that in the future you understand the consequences and you can, attribute to society. If that doesn't happen, there is a not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility, but that's more so looking at brain damage, like if someone has autism or something like that, that because of the actual damage, they should have a diminished responsibility because they physically weren't able to understand, those kind of things we talk about, the consequences, all that stuff. The last thing I want to talk about before we go is getting a little bit into the classifying of mental disorders. really I just wanted to point out that many people that suffer from mental disorders are comorbid, and that is that they suffer from more than one mental disorder. And sometimes this can be progressed from a primary disorder that leads into a secondary disorder. And if that's kind of confusing to you, you can think of it as someone who has anxiety, let's say, that they're constantly nervous, they're very anxious in environments, they're very worried all the time, and let's say they're looking at all this worry and they're recognizing it, and they're diagnosed, they 100% have anxiety disorder. And they may then take that and then look at the people around them and say, look at what's so wrong with me, why am I always worried, why am I always the one that's so concerned, everybody around me, even though they may not actually be, this person could perceive them as all normal, all totally chilled, never worried, nothing. And that can start to get into some self-hating tendencies and maybe over time progress into depression. So things like that are very easy to jump to. That example is not much of a stretch, but it can kind of show you that it's easy to, take something that's affecting your day-to-day functioning, and if you don't take care of that and you don't, work to improve that because you're afraid of the stigmatization or societal views or anything like that, it can progress and it can lead into other things. It can sort of seep symptoms into another disorder. And it's unfortunate a lot of times because a lot of times it takes an action. It takes somebody noticing, a friend or a family member, something to happen for somebody to seek help or somebody to recognize that someone needs help. So really why I wanted to focus on the normativity and not really the terms is because I'm very passionate about helping people with mental disorders. This is why I'm teaching this class. This is why I'm engaged in this field. And I just feel like people need to take a break kind of shoving people with mental disorders down so much, because it is a fairly normal thing that's occurring. And really it's people dealing with fairly normal things that are 100% understandable. And the more we kind of normalize and accept that this goes on in society and it's not this big, weird, abnormal thing that we need to hide, I think the more, as a society as a whole, we're going to be able to grow, and we're going to be able to quickly diagnose and treat people more effectively, essentially. So, as always, though, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I know that this discussion was a little different, but I hope you guys liked it, and feel free to ask me anything, or if there was a specific disorder you saw you want to know more about or something, just, again, shoot me an email. I'm always around. But other than that, you'll have a great day, and I'll see you next time.